Podcast where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jotham Busfield. I'm here with my co-host John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing Kevin Love and anxiety. Most of our episodes are going to have this type of format where we try to highlight one player and one mental health issue. Today is Kevin Love as the player and anxiety is the mental health issue that we're going to explore in more detail. John, how familiar were you with Kevin Love before doing research for this podcast?
You know, other than a pain in my side as a Celtics fan, I didn't really have any idea about any of this stuff from beforehand. I know he was a talented basketball player and sort of always dominated against the Celtics. That's kind of my only understanding of him. And then this was really great to kind of dive into more of this piece and learn a little bit more about what he's been struggling with and how he's been trying to cope with it.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember him from the UCLA days where he was playing with Westbrook. I remember he was a big name coming out of college. I think Westbrook ended up going ahead of him in the draft, maybe third, where he went fifth, which was a surprise. And he ended up in Minnesota. And a couple things stand out. I mean, I remember he was a double-double machine kind of his entire career, always killed the Celtics. He lost a little bit of baby fat. I feel like when he first came into the league, he was pretty big and pretty husky, and clearly bought into the getting into physical shape aspect of being a professional athlete. And you could see the transformation that took place, over the first 4, 5, 6 years in the league. And then, he went to Cleveland and paired up with LeBron. I think that's where he won a championship and where, how most people kind of define it. So a quick bio on Kevin Love. He's an American professional basketball player in the NBA for the Cleveland Cavaliers. He was taken 5th in the 2008 NBA draft by the Memphis Grizzlies, but traded immediately after the draft to the Minnesota Timberwolves, where he began his career and played for 6 seasons. In 2014, Love was traded to the Cleveland Cavs, and he's played there ever since. He's a 5-time All-Star and won an NBA championship with the Cavs in 2016. He was also a member of the gold medal-winning U.S. national team at the 2010 FIBA World Championship and the 2012 Summer Olympics. A few random facts about Kevin Love that we found interesting. He's the son of former NBA player Stan Love. His uncle, Mike Love, is a founding member of the band The Beach Boys. You a Beach Boys fan, John?
Oh, yeah, big time.
Not so much myself, but that's neither here nor there. He grew up and played sports with NBA player Klay Thompson. I think he played baseball with him.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. Talk about a lot of talent in one town, right?
Yeah.
In 2018, he established the Kevin Love Fund to provide tools and help for people to improve their physical and emotional well-being, with the goal of assisting more than 1 billion people over the next 5 years. And we'll put a link to the Kevin Love Fund in the show notes in case anyone wants to look more into that or donate. So here we get into the player spotlight. And I think we have two aspects of this podcast episode. One is the player spotlight, where we look at their experience. The second one is the mental health spotlight, where we look at a particular mental health issue. We get into more detail with that. Today is anxiety. So for the player spotlight, we look at kind of the where, the what, and the how. Where have they spoken out about mental health? What have they said? How have they dealt with their mental health issues? For Kevin Love, we looked at a few different sources. He wrote a couple Player Tribune articles, one in 2018 and one in 2020. The one in 2018 was really about the panic attack that he had in game, which I think is where he's probably most known for in terms of coming out about mental health. He also was interviewed along with DeMar DeRozan for the Aspen Institute as part of the Aspen Ideas Festival by Michael Gervais, who's a performance psychologist, which I found a pretty interesting interview. He was a guest on the Anxious Achiever podcast with Maura Aarons Mele. Hopefully I'm not butchering that name. Season 3, Episode 7, and numerous other articles have been written about his experience. So, John, what were your key takeaways just from looking into some of these sources and hearing his words about mental health and anxiety?
Yeah, I think first it was just all around refreshing to hear a professional athlete be talking about these types of issues. There was a bunch of takeaways that I took from him. 3 that really stood out was, he refers to something he called the playbook, which was, him as a guy growing up in this society about, the stigmas around where he needed to be and he had to remain quiet and he had to, tough it up, be a man. And not ask for help, figure it out himself, and that's sort of throughout the entire article that he wrote. And he talked about that one of his biggest fears was for people finding out. And he said that when he was worried about coming up and talking about his own anxiety, he was really worried about what people would think about him. And I find that happens a lot of times when working with athletes, that they almost miss the fact that they're struggling with their own anxiety, and they're just as, if not more, worried about what other people are going to think of them once people find out that they have this. And I thought it was refreshing for him to be talking about that he's actually felt more empowered with more people knowing about it and seeking help. And that was one of the first things that really, really stood out to me when I was reading that. The other thing that really stood out, and this is kind of where we get into this stuff, is that he talked a lot about, for his whole career, he's had some of the best coaches, some of the best mentors, some of the best teammates. And, you know, most of that coaching is predominantly speaking about physical training, you know, best drills, best practices, best nutrition, all those different things. And one of the biggest gaps for him in that was that there was not any support around these pieces. And it's not necessarily a detriment or on purpose by these coaches. It's just no one has enough knowledge about this type of training and the need for this. And, you know, what we've noticed, and what the whole purpose of this whole podcast is, that we've seen more and more people coming out and talking about these issues. And hopefully with more people like Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan talking about these things, that they, you know, will start to catch on that there's a huge need for this. And that's why it's so important for us to continue to have these conversations, to continue to draw more attention to the importance of having not only a coach that's working on, you know, your physical development or you're making sure your nutrition is right, but also making sure that your mind's right, and having people and support systems that way. And the last piece that, you know, one of the themes that was sort of throughout his Tribune that really stuck out to me was, again, he used the phrase talking about it, and it was sort of all throughout the entire article. And again, talking about why it was so important for him to just start to talk about it. And he realized that once he started addressing some of the issues, a lot of them had nothing to do with athletics at all. In fact, he actually talks a great deal about that, you know, when he started talking about it, when he was working with a therapist, you know, sort of going over this after that panic attack in game, he said it was really nice to find, you know, he did found that the conversations weren't about his sports, weren't about athletics. It was about other issues. And from that work, he was really able to identify that there were unresolved issues that had been holding him back and been causing some of these things for him. And, you know, and he talks a lot about the importance of just learning to talk about it. I think as guys growing up, we don't have as many opportunities necessarily to learn even how to do that, right? We get so conditioned to bottle things up, bury it down, to the point where, you know, the way that I describe it is sort of like a trash compactor, right? If you take all this stuff and you squish it into this tiny little ball, and then when you try to unpack it, it's hard to distinguish what's what. And so the first thing is really just figuring out, okay, what is this, and how to discuss it, and how to sort of bring it up to the surface. And I really appreciated him talking about the importance of that. Those were really some of the biggest takeaways that I took from sort of doing the research on him, and that Players Tribune article specifically. You know, that he was really worried and fearful of what people would think about him. I think that that's a really big one, that fear of judgment for having a mental issue that he's going through. That he didn't feel he had a lot of support around these issues sort of as he was developing as an athlete. And then the importance of just learning to talk about it. Those were the things that really stood out to me when I was sort of going through these things.
Yeah, so I'm gonna touch on those in reverse a little bit, because those are three great points, three great takeaways. The third one you mentioned, the final one, was, you know, just learning how to talk about it, learning how to open up. And it's interesting because one of the things he says, he has this quote where he says, excuse my language, earmuffs, kids, some days are just, quote unquote, some days are just shit, right? Question mark, quote. So he's just coming out and saying, I'm going to come out and talk about how I have to accept that some days are not going to be perfect. I mean, even that. So he talked to a therapist, that's helpful. But even just him saying that some days are not going to be good, and I'm going to accept that, I think is proof that he's learning how to talk about it and how to accept some of these things that are going on. So just being able to say something like that can make a person feel better, because they're accepting and embracing the emotion that they're dealing with instead of trying to fight against it. I think a lot of times what we see is people dealing with some of these negative emotions, whether it's anxiety or depression, their instant goal is, how do I make this go away?
Right.
And that makes sense, but it's kind of, the path to making it go away is kind of counterintuitive. You almost have to stop trying to make it go away and learn how to embrace it and learn about it, and have some respect for it and get to know it a little bit, and that will actually help it go away quicker, as opposed to trying to fight it, trying to run away. So that was the third takeaway you made that I want to touch on first. The second one was, just knowing that there's not, at least at the time, there weren't really services in place within the organization, within the league for mental health. And I think, he kind of touches on the moment he had the panic attack, kind of relates to this a little bit. I mean, I think there was a moment where he had the panic attack in game, and then he was in the locker room, I believe, and the trainer's kind of saying to him, Kevin, what do you need? What do you need?
Right.
And I think that on the one hand, it's impossible for anyone to really be able to, provide the perfect solution in that moment, because it's almost a little bit too late. He's already in the middle of a panic attack. But on the other hand, it shows that, maybe that's an area where if they had someone on staff that knows how to deal with a panic attack in the moment, knows how to ground somebody and help them come out of that at least a little bit quicker, it can make a big difference. They may have been able to see what was really going on, because he ended up going to the hospital and having all these tests done. So it was clear that no one on the staff really knew what was going on, where if that was a mental health professional, they'd probably be able to recognize a panic attack that was happening. So that was one thing he talked about with regard to not having maybe the support in place on the team at that time. I think this also relates to another takeaway I had, where he talks about how he knows how lucky he is. And I think this is a misconception that fans have with athletes, that just because they're famous, just because they're professional athletes in the limelight, just because they make millions of dollars, that they're supposed to just be good to go. Their life is perfect. Everything's fine. Suck it up. Everything should be good. And that's not the case. I mean, a lot of these guys, a lot of these players, right, male, female, or in between, they know how lucky they are. They know that they're privileged. They know that they have access to funds and money. But that doesn't change the fact that they still struggle like every other person on the planet. I mean, mental health doesn't discriminate. So I think that kind of relates to that second point you made. The first point you made, that was the first takeaway I had, was the men's playbook, right? The be strong, don't talk about feelings, get through it on your own. And I think that's clearly such a hallmark of being a guy, probably globally, but definitely in America. And it's gotten better. It's better in 2020 than it was certainly when Kevin Love was growing up. But I think we have to understand that there's a kind of deferment period here, where if someone like Kevin Love is coming out about this, he's in, I think, his early 30s. He grew up in the 90s. This is a huge head start on him having those ingrained thoughts that he grew up around. And so maybe kids, that are growing up today are going to have access to a different mindset. I still think we have a ways to go, but it's certainly improving. So that was definitely one of my main takeaways. On your last takeaway, I think one thing that stood out to me is that he did say his greatest joy, your last takeaway was him learning how to talk about it, talking with a therapist. His greatest joy is not from fame, money, or achievement. And I think that stood out because a takeaway I had that relates to this was that one of the main issues he started to see, either on his own or in therapy, was that his identity and his self-worth were tied to the act of playing basketball, which is always risky to overlap those things, right? And we talk a lot about process over product, right? When it comes to working with clients on goal setting, because if your goals are end product related, you're always only as good as the outcome, right? So if the outcome is good, right? If you make a ton of money, if you succeed in basketball, you win a championship, great. You're going to feel good about yourself for a little bit then, but that fades. And let's face it, life is not that perfect, right? Things don't always go right. So when things don't go the way you want them to, if the outcomes are not aligned with what you want them to be, you can see how that leaves a person in a very vulnerable position. They're going to end up having a key takeaway from that experience being, I'm not good enough, right? So the key is, we work a lot with clients on separating the act from the person. You can't be defined by the goals that you're setting or the things you want to accomplish, because it's going to leave you open to something really bad happening if things don't go exactly the way you want them to. Whereas if you set goals in a process-oriented way, you can hold yourself accountable on a day-to-day basis on the scale of one day. What have I done today in accordance with my process that I can hold my head high about and feel good about, regardless of the outcomes, the stuff that I can't control? So I thought that was interesting. A couple other takeaways. It's interesting because he credits DeMar DeRozan as being the first NBA player to step up. And we're going to talk about DeMar DeRozan in our second episode. I didn't actually know that DeMar DeRozan was the first one to come out and start top from the NBA perspective.
I had no idea.
I didn't know that until really researching Kevin Love and seeing how vocal he has been about crediting DeMar DeRozan as the person who, and I think we'll get into this in our second episode, but DeMar DeRozan really came out on Twitter initially about his depression, and just seeing him do that, right, being the first person to do it, I think gave Kevin Love the confidence to say, hey, if he can do it, I can do it. And I think that points to how, we're all in this together. I think people need to see role models doing things like this. That's why it's so important that athletes are starting to speak up about this stuff, because non-athletes are going to see them do it. And I think it's going to make it much easier for them to accept, the potential to get help, talk to somebody, open up, that kind of thing. Any other takeaways that you had from this, John?
Well, one thing I want to expand upon when you brought up sort of like the athlete's identity and the focus on product, I think, athletes are rated, right? They're valued on their output, right? When they're looking for recruitment, what are your stats? What are your numbers? What are your, what's your output as an athlete? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's part of the contributing factor of why that there's so much focus on that. And I see this pretty much with every single athlete that I work with, is that their entire self-worth and identity is wrapped up in their what they can produce, right? And it's not, you don't have complete control over those things, and so it's unsustainable and it's unreliable mm-hmm. as an avenue to sort of develop your own self-confidence. And I see this all the time. So to your point, when things don't go well, inevitably when they don't go well, if you don't have other pillars of strength to sort of rely on, because you are not just an athlete, that is a part of you, but it is not the sole, it is not the the entirety of you. A lot of the stuff that we look to do is to develop other areas of confidence. So you talked about what are other areas that you can sort of develop as strength in your routines and other goals that you might be working towards, and really learning to focus on, rather than the I want to be a triple-double type of player every single game. I want to focus on what's the process for me to get there and really highlight that. And I think that's a difficult shift for a lot of athletes, because, like I said, they're so conditioned to be thinking about, I had 20 points this game, or I had, this or that. And I think that that's just part of the language that they have growing up. And we really have to try to shift that a little bit to help them see that, yes, that's important, but it's not the only thing that you need to be relying on. So I thought that was just a good point to bring up.
For sure, and I think baseball is a great example of this, because you can have a play baseball where in a game you absolutely crush the ball 4 out of 4 times and hit it right at somebody, and your stat line is going to show 0 for 4. But if you look at the process, did I approach the at bat the right way? Did I make good contact? Did I drive the ball where I wanted to? You're batting 1,000 there, right? Whereas you can have a game where you go 3 for 4. With the 3 hits you got were pretty poor swings, but so it's going to look good in the stat line. But so that's where I think what you're hinting at is that athletes really should not be judging themselves period, but assessing themselves
right
based on outcomes, stats, things like that. They got to really stick to a process. It's interesting because one other thing that stood out about him is that his default setting, and I think this is how he referred to it. His default setting was dread. Ever since he was a kid. And I think that, I don't want to say it hints at genetics, because that makes it sound like there's something wrong with his family, which there isn't. But I think mental health runs in families. Mental health issues does run in families. It can be passed down genetically. And sometimes it's just bad luck. And I think, when it comes to anxiety or other mental health issues, it comes from a complex set of risk factors, right? It can be genetics, it can be brain chemistry, it can be personality, it can be life events, it can be a combination of all those 4 things. And for Kevin Love, it sounds like there's a little bit of just bad luck. His wiring was slanted a little bit more towards anxiety and depression, because and unless I'm missing something, I could always be missing something that there was. We don't want to speculate. There could be things that he went through when he was a kid that we don't know about. But it sounds like just from a very young age, his setting was always set to dread, right? Worst case scenario, negativity, that kind of thing. He even references Robin Williams. I think this is where dread and distraction seem to be the 2 main things that Kevin Love kind of was putting into action for most of his life, right? Where he references Robin Williams as an example, something that he relates to, because Robin Williams used to, bike during the day, exercise profusely, and then do stand-up comedy at night. And he was doing those things to kind of wear out the demons, so to speak, wear out that background noise, that rumination, that constant just, soundtrack of negativity that's playing. And it's understandable why people do that. And sometimes it's impossible to shut that off completely. But I think distraction is what most people go to get away from it. And that's delaying the inevitable. I think, like we talked about, how he's gotten better is by accepting and embracing the emotion, not running from it, not trying to distract it, not trying to silence it, trying to get to know it a little bit, trying to understand it. And I don't think it's coincidence that when he started doing that, he started to get better. Now, he also talked about how getting better doesn't mean being perfect. Right. Mental health is hard work, and it doesn't mean that even if you're doing all the right stuff that you're going to be perfectly happy every day. But that's not what we're going for. We're going for a better quality of life, day to day on average. And there's going to be some down days, right? Like he said, some days are just shit, and then there's going to be some good days, but at least all the days won't be dread like he was experiencing before. Any other takeaways for you from Kevin Love?
No, those were really my main ones. That from the articles that we read through. So I thought that those were sort of the biggest points that I really took away from those.
Okay, I had a couple more. I think I'll touch on one maybe. Is the combination of a quote he said, where he said it's exhausting, right? Discussing anxiety, and then we'll also get into the panic attack he had a little bit, because I think there's definitely a connection between anxiety and depression. I think even in one of the interviews, maybe was it the performance psychologist that was giving the interview between him and DeMar DeRozan, he referred to it as two sides of the same coin. And I think that's a good way to put it, because there's definitely a connection. I think a lot of the same thoughts and variables and factors that drive anxiety drive depression. And the reason why they're two sides of the same coin is that, like, anxiety, when you're dealing with anxiety on a day-to-day basis, it is so draining for that person. So draining. I mean, you're keyed up. You're expending a lot of energy to fuel that anxiety, to continue to have it keep going, right? It needs energy. Anxiety requires fuel to keep going. And so it's no coincidence that when a person deals with anxiety for long enough, even for a couple of days, their risk of depression goes up big time, because depression is quite literally a depressed mood, right? So if you're expending all your fuel, boom, now you're depleted and you got nothing left and you're hopeless and you're exhausted, and that is depression, right? And we're going to get into that in the second episode. But so it's no coincidence that those two things tie together. I think that also relates to his panic attack, because panic attack, let's say someone had panic disorder, what happens that drives the first panic attack is often very different than what drives future panic attacks. The first panic attack tends to be a perfect storm of factors, and he even refers to it as that, where for him, I think I wrote some notes down, the perfect storm for him was stress with family, bad sleep, expectations from his team. We're going to talk about expectations in general, but expectations from the team combined with a subpar 4 and 5 start. So the team and him, and he were having expectations about how that season was going to go, and it wasn't living up to it, right? So Annie's dealing with bad sleep. Annie's dealing with stress from the family. So all that kind of stuff culminated to drive that first panic attack. I would say it's also probably, he touches on what led to him getting to that point, and it was, holding things in for way too long, right? He talks about his grandmother passing in 2013 as something that he did not, effectively resolve the grief or even approach the grief from that. And he was feeling guilty about not talking to her enough before she passed away. So that's a whole different level of shame and guilt added to the grief that he did not process. So that was wearing on him for years. We're talking 5 years of that wearing down on him. And then he's got these other factors more in the short term: family, bad sleep, expectations from the team, and boom, panic attack. Now, I don't know what his panic attack situation has been since then. I know he referenced that that's his only public one he's had. That makes me think maybe he's had other ones. But what happens is the first panic attack comes from the perfect storm. The future ones, they come from the fact that once a person's experienced that, it's a very traumatic event, because they usually think they're having a heart attack. It is not a fun thing to deal with for anyone who has. And I think after that, as soon as they have one symptom that resembles that first panic attack, whether it's increased heart rate, tension in the muscles, shortness of breath, things that relate to that first experience, their mind's gonna go to, oh no, it's happening again. And it's the mind is a powerful thing. Them saying that to themselves is what often causes future panic attacks. So I think it's interesting, because you see the interrelation between anxiety, depression, panic, and how a lot of this stuff is cumulative. It's not like just doesn't come out of the blue.
Yeah, and I think that's to your point. I think your brain codes that, right? So it goes through that first initial panic attack of that perfect storm that you're talking about. And then to your point, I mean, it can be all the things you talked about: heart rate, shortness of breath, pieces like that. It could also be an emotional reaction, right? So one of the emotions he might be going through that caused that initial, if it happens again in the future, could be another sort of trigger, sort of moving forward to cause those things to come up sort of in the future for them. And so that's why talking about it and resolving those past pieces is so important.
Absolutely. So we're going to get a little bit into the mental health spotlight at this point. So we're going to get into anxiety as a mental health issue in general. We got some data from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the U.S., affecting 40 million adults in the United States age 18 and older, or 18.1% of the population every year, which is pretty high. Anxiety disorders are highly treatable, but only 36.9% of those suffering actually receive treatment, which tells me that there's still a lot of people that are suffering in silence and not getting the support they need.
Huge gap.
Huge gap. And either that's because a lot of times they don't want to come out and talk about it, and sometimes they can't find access to good care. Both are issues.
Or they think this is just normal. A lot of times I get people who coming in, they just assumed that this was just how things were.
Yeah.
And they had no idea that this was something that they were going through that wasn't necessary to their life.
For sure. I mean, especially humans have this crazy ability to adapt to even the worst situations. And if you've dealt with this for a long time, you just think it's your norm. You're used to it, and you don't realize that things could be different if you take a certain step. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Anxiety disorders develop from a complex set of risk factors that as we discussed earlier, can be genetics, brain chemistry, personality, life events, or a combination of all those things. So it's usually not just one. Now, certain levels of anxiety are healthy and can be helpful. So it's not all bad. I think mild anxiety can usually mean that you want to accomplish something, that something's meaningful to you, that kind of thing. So I think anxiety gets a bad rap on the whole, which is understandable, but it's not all bad. So we don't want to look at this as an all or nothing, black and white kind of thing. A little bit of anxiety is okay.
Right.
It's when it gets to that, higher level that it gets problematic.
Right. It's about managing it. It's not about like removing. I think that's a hard concept for people that I come into talking about, of like they got to get rid of their anxiety. It's like, well, no, actually it's your body preparing to do something, like you said, that's meaningful or that's difficult. It's your body preparing to do something like that. So if we get rid of that, then you're sort of losing that as an asset. But if you're into the state where you're paralyzed by it or having these panic attacks, then obviously that needs to be managed differently, and you need to sort of pull back in that way.
Absolutely. So there is a difference between mild day-to-day anxiety and a diagnosable mood disorder. I saw mood disorders in the anxiety realm include generalized anxiety disorder, or often referred to as GAD, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, agoraphobia, which is kind of highlighted by a fear of leaving the home or fear of crowded, compact places, and then specific phobias, think like arachnophobia, fear of spiders, things like that. So I want to highlight there's a key difference between anxiety and stress. I think this is important to note. The difference between them is that, in my opinion anyway, stress is something external that we are under. Anxiety is an internal reaction involving excessive worry. At times, even if no direct sources of stress are even present.
Right.
So there's a key difference. I think sometimes, language matters. People use those terms interchangeably. I'm feeling stressed out, but really what that means is I'm feeling anxious, and then there may be sources of stress. There may not be, right? So in terms of anxiety as a diagnosis, we like to be jargon-free in our work, but also on this podcast. We're not going to throw a bunch of big terms at people. And if listeners out there catch us doing that, feel free to call us out, whether that's on Twitter or something else. Troll away if you hear us using jargon. So we're not going to go into the full jargony, DSM-5 diagnosis of anxiety. DSM-5 is the Diagnostics and Statistical Manual that therapists use to effectively diagnose people. So we'll just kind of cover the main bases when it comes to what anxiety is. Essentially, it's worry that is excessive and difficult to control most days for at least 6 months, and it's usually highlighted by 3 or more of 6 of the following symptoms. First one is being restless or keyed up, kind of on edge. Second one is easily fatigued. Third one is trouble concentrating. Fourth is irritability. Fifth is muscle tension, and sixth is sleep disturbance. So that's basically the kind of the main factors that might lead someone listening to be like, oh, maybe I'm dealing with some anxiety on a regular basis. So what do people do about it, John, when it comes to solving their anxiety problem? I want to touch on a quick disclaimer about mental health tips, because we're going to give some tips in each of these episodes for people dealing with some of these issues. What can they do about it? How can they try to get some relief? A lot of tools and strategies with mental health are easy to understand, hard to execute. Okay, right. So the number one reason they're hard to execute is this kind of fraudulent mindset that we see a lot of, quote unquote. It can't be that easy to solve this, right? It can't just be as easy as doing X, Y, Z. And I think it is, and it isn't that easy. It's easy to comprehend what some of these solutions are, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to execute. And a good example is working out, right? If a person's overweight, what are they told?
Yeah, go work out.
Go work out, right? That's an easy to identify solution. There is a billion-dollar industry around weight loss and exercise and working out. The reason for that is there's a lot of recidivism. People have a tough time actually losing weight and consistently working out. So that it's very easy to just go work out, just get in shape, right? It's not easy, right?
Yeah, eat healthy. You
can
do it.
Right? So it doesn't take, this isn't some high level concepts. And I think, to me, there's a bit of a stigma here with mental health, where I think people look at mental health and they think psychology, and they think there's got to be some crazy psychological, path to getting better that, requires some really in-depth solution. And sometimes it requires unpacking our psychology and really looking at what's going on.
Right.
But a lot of times it's about easily identified strategies, but they're really hard to execute. And I think people sort of push it off for that reason. They think, like, it can't just be that easy. So I would encourage people listening to, be aware of the mind's tendency to downplay great solutions due to negativity, denial, or excuse making, which is designed to avoid hard work. That's kind of a trained response by the brain. It deludes ourselves into thinking that there's no point in order to give ourselves permission to avoid change. To me, that's what happens a lot, is that people unconsciously are looking for a reason to avoid because work is hard, right? Mm-hmm. And change is hard. And so that's going to give them that permission. So before we get into it, I'm going to start with your feedback on what people dealing with anxiety can do about it. We always agree that it's always best to seek some professional help and work with someone, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great disclaimer, because we can have we have lots of tips and strategies that we go into, but obviously the work is highly individualistic based on who is sitting in front of us and who we're working for. And so a lot of the way that I sort of start the conversation is talking about it more of like, let's come up with a menu of options. What are things that you've typically gone to in the past to help you deal with stress? Like, a lot of times people already have a menu of options. They might not know that they're doing it, but they have a menu of options. So a lot of times I hear people, they like to write, read, be physical.
So the first thing you do is identify what they're already doing.
Yeah,
which is great.
I work on trying to figure out, like, if they even recognize that they're using coping skills. I sort of identify those as such and start to come up with a menu. The other thing that I really focus on in my work with everybody that I do, I call it sort of like a foundational tool, is breathing. And I think that the reason why I coach that so heavily with people is, one, the majority of people breathe incorrectly and actually breathe in such a way that they're actually sort of giving signals to their brain that they are in distress. So I'll speak about that in just a second. But the reason why I focus so much on breathing is it's an unbelievably great grounding mechanism and tool. So grounding is sort of the concept of when you might be having more panic, you get really stuck up in your head, you're thinking, thought loops are happening and you're constantly thinking about all the stuff that's happening. Breathing is a really great place to, like, let's bring you back down to reality and bring you back down to what's going on right now. So that's why I teach it. The other real reason is you can do it wherever you are. So oftentimes when I'm going through that initial menu of options for people of, like, what are you doing for yourself? Like I said, I get writing, reading, playing music, listening to music, going outside, and those are all fabulous, and I never downplay those as, effective options. The only issue with that is that if you're a student and you're sitting in class during a final, you can't ask the professor to, can I go ride my bike, or can I go listen to music? It's not an option to be able to use that. Breathing you carry with you everywhere. And that's why I start with that as a real focus. And, I really go through a pretty comprehensive assessment of breathing. And so there's something called your BIQ, or your breath IQ, that focuses on, where on your body is it moving when you're breathing. Mm-hmm. So typically people breathe in sort of vertically. So all their air kind of is stuck up in their chest. And if you think about it from, like, an athlete standpoint, if you've just done something physically exerting, you're typically breathing short, fast, up in the chest, and that's giving signals to your brain that you're under distress. And if you're breathing that way when you're not physically tired or in distress, you're still giving signals to your brain that you're in a stressed state. And so that saturation of all those chemicals, cortisol and adrenaline, sort of running through your system, you're sort of keeping yourself in a perpetual state of anxiety and stress. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I really teach diaphragmatic breathing, or belly breathing, or horizontal breathing, whatever you want to call it, and really helping to move the location of the air down into where it needs to be in the diaphragm. Mm-hmm. You pull in 50% more oxygen to the brain. It feeds great chemicals to the brain, all those feel-good chemicals that make you feel better, grounded, activates the parasympathetic system. I know we're not getting jargoning, so you guys can call me out right now. But it's a really, really effective tool. Flagged. It's a really effective tool, and it's one of the most important tools to use. Mm-hmm. And then from that breathing, we really get into body awareness. And that's sort of like that next step past breathing. I want to teach people how to effectively breathe, coach them on the importance of why I'm doing that, and then help them identify that there are probably physiological signs in their body that are telling them that they are starting to become into a stress state. So you talked about like people might feel hot, right? It's usually their heart rate is increasing, pumping blood to the extremities, temperatures go up, tension in the shoulders or in the fists or in the stomach, all those different places. And if you can coach people on how to identify those symptoms sooner rather than later, you can then turn to those menu of options to help decrease those stress symptoms so that you can catch it. A lot of times I get people coming into my door and talking about like, you know, what do I do when I'm in the middle of a panic attack, right? What do I do when I'm feeling overly anxious? And I have to sort of be the bearer of bad news and say, you know, you're too late, right?
Yeah,
if you're in the middle of a panic attack, you can try to do grounding exercises. You can try to do these types of things. But for anyone who's experienced those, thinking is not really anything that's really going on, right? Your brain is just firing on a massive amount of level and it's going too quickly for you to say like, you know what, let me just stop for a second, think about what I should do, right? That's not something that's typically happening.
Yeah.
But I get that like 1 minute I'm fine, 1 minute I'm completely out of control. And my work with people is to say like, you know what, there were probably 3 or 4 things that happened in between that you need to learn how to be aware of so that you can implement those, you know, those strategies before you get to the point where they're no longer going to be effective. So that's sort of like the base of the work that I do in the beginning is really, like I said, that foundational skill of breath and body awareness is because, like I said, you can carry it with wherever you go. And that's why it's one of the more effective tools that I typically start with. And then based on who I'm working with, we make it more individualistic based on what works for them or what might not work for them.
Yeah, I think that's great. You made some great points. You know, the first thing you touched on was just helping a person understand that they're probably already doing some good things. They might just not be giving themselves any credit. I think a big part of anxiety and depression is what's called, I mean, these are kind of related, but they're sometimes different, you know, negative fixation and then disqualifying the positive. These are very like, you know, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, jargony terms. So, but it's basically a mindset, you know, where they really pay a lot of attention, extra attention to the stuff they're not doing well, and they give themselves no credit for the things they're doing well. It's like, yeah, well, I should be doing that, right? That kind of thing.
Right.
So I think by doing what you did, you know, you're pointing out, hey, you're doing some good things already. I think that's going to validate them. It's going to make them feel like it's not all up to the expert to give them a perfect solution. They're doing some great stuff themselves. You also talked about breathing. Breathing is definitely, to me, falls into that category of people coming in, they hear breath work, they hear breathing, and they roll their eyes and they go, yeah, okay, can't be that easy, right? So this exactly is what we were talking about earlier, where some of these things are easy to identify, hard to actually put into practice. Getting your breathing into a good place is not easy. It's not easy. It's not easy to start doing it. It's not easy to continue doing it. You know, you really have to put a lot of effort into it. And so I would encourage people to really buy into that because it does help quite a bit, and it does help with grounding. I think grounding techniques are important. And again, when they're in a panic attack, it is too late. You're just trying to get from, you know, if something's going to be, you know, really bad, you're trying to make it a little bit less bad, right? Yep. So instead of taking 30 minutes, you want to help them get out in 12 or 15. Ideally, it's not going to be much less than that. So, but that being said, grounding is really important because with anxiety, I think the way I would encourage people to look at it is that you're living in your imagination. That's really what anxiety is. It's imagination and creativity turned in a very negative, dark direction. We all have the ability to be creative and use our imagination for positive things, right? In the workplace or with friends, with humor, creating things like imagining kind of funny things, daydreaming about positive things, daydreaming about vacations before they come, stuff like that. But that imagination doesn't know negative or positive. It just does what it does. So if you turn it into towards a negative direction, it's going to go to some dark places. And I think that's what happens when people are anxious. Their imagination is taken over, and they are floating in the sky in a very negative kind of dystopian universe here. And grounding is going to pull them back down to reality a little bit so that they're not living in that made-up, very negative, dark, perspective or environment. You also mentioned a little bit about parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and you got flagged, but that's okay.
Yeah,
we're going to go into that because I think it is important. You know, to try to put it into, easier terms, I think we have these two parts of our nervous system. There's a sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is like the gas pedal, right? That's like adrenaline, cortisol, stress hormone, stuff that's pumping us up, which can be good sometimes, but for anxiety, not good if that's if the gas is all the way, the pedal is all the way down. Parasympathetic nervous system is the brake pedal. So that's what's going to keep us in check.
Right.
And there are certain things that help engage that system more than the sympathetic nervous system.
Yep.
And you talked about breathing, focused breathing techniques and grounding techniques are things that, really help engage the parasympathetic nervous system. Mindfulness-based meditation is big for that.
Absolutely.
Massage, warm showers, think sensory kind of stuff is also really important for that. So when I think about anxiety and working with a client on this kind of thing, I kind of think like higher level and then reactive and proactive strategies, right? So higher level, my main thing for people is remove expectations everywhere if possible. And I don't know where, forgive me if we're not accurately quoting who had this quote, but I read somewhere a long time ago this quote that said, happiness equals reality minus expectations. I totally believe that. And I think if you want to be happy and your expectations are up here, way above what reality is probably going to be, and you subtract those from each other, you're going to end up pretty low. You're going to end up feeling like what you see is not good. Whereas if you just remove expectations, then it's much easier to roll with what happens and feel pretty good about some things. Yep. So I think you want to plan and hope for good things to happen, but don't expect anything. So replace expect with accept, right? That's what we want to do. Replace expect with accepting things a little bit more, accepting how things play out. So that's higher level, right? So that's just about mindset and the filter people have. If they have expectations, then their filter is going to set them up for failure, I think. In terms of reactive and proactive strategies, I think you talked about a lot of reactive stuff, right? It's kind of like a last resort, focused breathing, grounding techniques. I think this is why substance use is such an issue, because there is no healthy solution that is ever going to make you feel as good as instantly as substances will. And that's why they're so tempting for people to go to, because they're suffering, they're struggling, they want relief, and boom, I can smoke a little bit of weed. Boom, I can have a drink. Boom, I can do something more serious, and it's going to make it magically go away. And they're numbing themselves. And that is so, you see why it's so tempting, because it's going to make your pain go away short term. But I like to encourage people to think about substance use like borrowing happiness. Whatever great stuff you feel when you use it, you're borrowing that from the next day. So if you're, starting out at a 10 out of 10 and you go down to 5 because you're anxious, and you borrow something to feel back at a 10 out of 10 on a certain day, you're taking that 5 away from the next day. So you're going to be starting out at 5 the next day. And then if you have a similar day, you're going to be back down to 0. And that's when, panic attacks happen and other things. So I think it's really important that people recognize there is no healthy solution that's going to do what substances do. It's why it's so risky and why it's so important to really be aware of that and stay away. Proactive strategies, I think this is where, again, it might be more work in some ways, but it's worth it, right? We talk about how prevention is a really tough sell sometimes, but you got to put in some work outside the moment to prevent yourself from ever getting into those kind of hard moments. So that involves like talking to somebody, right? It could be a therapist, it could be just a friend or family member you trust. It's, part of getting better is making sure you're not getting worse. That's a huge thing. Like, you got to stem the slide a little bit. So having that release valve of talking to somebody is really important. Healthy morning and night routines and prioritizing sleep can definitely help. I think most people would roll their eyes at that, but it makes a huge difference. We talked about mindfulness-based meditation and breathing. Adaptive responses throughout the day. It's very easy to fixate on negativity, so trying to get into a way of adaptively responding, right, in terms of how you look at something can help. We also talk a little bit about counteracting the slant towards negativity. I think that's a proactive strategy. The brain is wired to be negative.
Absolutely.
At least 3 times, I think, as much as positive.
Yep. And
if you factor in culture in 2020 and media, and the fact that media is created by a bunch of people slanted towards negativity because they're human too,
right?
It's probably more like 5 to 1, 10 to 1. In a pandemic, 20 to 1. I don't know, right? So, I think we have to do things that are going to, really even the odds here. I mean, we're fighting an uphill battle against our brain's tendency towards being negative. So one thing I've done, and I think, again, it's eye roll worthy for a lot of people, especially guys, is what's called a grateful exercise or grateful project, where you're just trying to write down 3 things per day that you feel good about, that you did well, or that you're grateful for. And again, first couple of days, you think, what is this going to do? 3 weeks in, you start seeing things that you didn't see before. And I call it the Tesla effect. I remember when, there's a psychological term for this too, but I'm not smart enough for that, and we're not going to get jargony. So it's where you see someone call something into your active attention that you didn't know was there, and then all of a sudden you start seeing it everywhere. And it was there the whole time, right? I remember the first time someone pointed out, I think my brother pointed out a Tesla, or someone pointed out Tesla a couple years ago when they first kind of became big. I was like, oh, those are pretty cool cars. I never really knew what they were. Started seeing them everywhere.
Yep.
They were there the whole time. I just wasn't aware of it until it was cued into my active awareness. Negativity, positivity kind of works like this, you know?
Yeah, and I think one thing, you bring up a great point. We're sort of predisposed to concentrate on negativity just from like a survival standpoint, right? Because we need to make sure we're protecting ourselves from perceived danger.
Absolutely.
And I think similar to the conversation that I have with anxiety, I have about negativity. And it's not about removal of all negativity, at all. One, that's not realistic. And two, negativity often comes with some truth to it. And I sort of see it as, again, you use the phrase of like the two sides of the same coin, and positivity and negativity, same thing. I think being able to view things, from a negative lens, but also be able to incorporate positivity to it and not letting it become so, finding it more of a balance between both. And it's not about just always being positive, always thinking great. And that's not realistic. And, to Kevin Love's point, like some days are going to be shit. And if you're thinking that you need to be positive, then you're going to be stuck in that internal battle of like, well, I'm supposed to be always okay, but I'm not feeling okay. And then that just creates more stress and anxiety. And I think being able to balance I feel this is a negative experience that might be happening. What truth can I pull from this? And then use positivity to move forward. I think that's a conversation that I try to have pretty often with people that I work with, that if your expectation, again, is to remove all negativity, it's not going to happen, because that's not really the purpose of what we're looking to do.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, with negativity, I think what you touched on is that it is important to be honest with yourself about the negative things that are happening. But like we discussed earlier, separate the self from the act, right? Just because something happened that's negative, if you overlap that onto your whole concept of yourself or your vision of your future, that's when it starts to get really problematic. You can call a negative thing, call it like you see it. Just separate it from your own identity a little bit, and that's where it can help. The last thing is, we do a lot of work with, self one versus self two, self one being like the actual self two being the internal critic. I think that one area that was popularized, it was in the book, The Inner Game of Tennis. You've had other sources that you've really seen that, play out during. And for us, I think it's about, just without getting too detailed on this, because we'll probably talk about it at some other point in more detail, but learning how to lead the critic a little bit, leading the internal critic, not the other way around. If your internal critic is leading the show 24/7, you're in trouble, because everything's going to be terrible and negative, and you're never going to be good enough. Right. If you learn how to bring in the critic when you need it, because it is a helpful piece of the puzzle, then it works to your advantage. And then when you don't need it, just politely ask it to kind of step away like a friend,
Yeah, you have to learn how to have a dialogue with it rather than it just being that one blaring voice in your head telling you that like you said, that you're not good enough. You have to be able to engage in a conversation with removal of judgment, but just sort of like I said, like pull from what you need, and then move on in a way that's more constructive to what you need.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this being the Grim Drive podcast, we are going to try to highlight some examples of Grim Drive from time to time. Grim Drive being, as we discussed in episode 0, for anyone who wants to hear, really our main approach to this podcast, episode 0 is a great way. We talk for about, 10, 12, 15 minutes about our whole mission behind this podcast and what we're trying to do. Grim Drive is really the relentless pursuit of goals, passion and purpose-driven goals, and just relentless pursuit of that. What would you say is a good example, maybe nowadays in 2020 of Grim Drive?
Yeah, I think for me personally, my own sort of grim drive is the work that we're doing. I think, as a therapist, by trade, it's sort of the perceived notion is like, you sit in an office, talk to people, go home, and that's it. And I think that my own grim drive has sort of driven me to want more, to access more people, to help more people, to be more engaging. And that includes doing things like a podcast or writing literature or, doing a bunch of different things. And I think that my purpose is to help as many people as possible. And I think that drive has led me to want to do as much as possible in different outlets to try to help as many people. Now, and we talk about this in episode 0, but I know a lot of people may be shaking their head and saying, it's workaholism and you're just, consumed, and aren't you just distracting yourself maybe from your own stuff? And, I think that's certainly something to always remain aware of and mindful of. And certainly that requires a lot of work on my end of making sure that I'm remaining self-aware of making sure that what I am doing is still aligned with that purpose. But I think that's that's my own personal example of Grim Drive, is sort of using multiple avenues to engage as many people as possible, that is aligned with my purpose, which is I'm here to help people. And, outside of just sort of my direct clinical work with my clients, also doing stuff like this, get the message out, help people understand that there is help places, help people understand different things to think about or try. And, that requires a ton of work. It requires a ton of hours, but for me, that's all worth it, because the end goal satisfies what's most important to me, which is to help as many people as possible.
I think that's a great example of Grim Drive, and I think what you're touching on is kind of the act of planting seeds. I think part of having that Grim Drive is planting seeds that might turn into something.
Yep.
I think Kevin Love kind of talked about this a little bit, or we can relate it. We can tie it back into him, because he talked about how it's not just if the results are poor and you're tying your sense of self to the results, and then the results are poor, you're going to feel bad. It's also if what you define yourself by, the act you define yourself by, is taken away, right? He talked, one big thing for him was, when he broke his wrist in Minnesota and had to sit out a bunch of time, it was like the only thing he had for his identity and his coping with anxiety was gone. It was gone, right? And so planting seeds is about how do I cultivate coping strategies? How do I cultivate interests and passions in my life, so that if one is taken away, I got other stuff that I like to go to, and I'm not defining myself by any of them,
right? But
I got things that I can go to that are going to keep me in a good place. So I think that's a great example of Grim Drive. The one I would give, because you and I are pretty similar, so I could talk about my experience as a therapist. I think it'd probably be similar to yours. I think nurses and doctors, right now,
Huge.
Especially in 2020, take some serious Grim Drive to be able to stick to what they're doing, work long hours, sometimes without the right supplies, putting themselves at risk, seeing people suffer, seeing people die. That is not an easy experience to have to do, and they're not paid enough for what they're doing. So I think I want to call some attention to that, because I think we're all sort of in their debt for the work that they've done over the last 10 plus months and moving forward.
Absolutely.
So as we come to the end of this podcast episode, I just want to remind people to click subscribe on your podcast listening platform and rate and review the podcast if possible. We really appreciate all feedback. We're going to offer a pair of free Celtics tickets to a game in 2021-2022. Unfortunately, this current season, it's about to start. I'm excited, but it doesn't sound like fans are going to be in the stands. So, but we are going to offer a pair of free Celtics tickets to a game in the following season. So 2021 to 2022 season, for one lucky person out of all who write an honest review for us in the first 3 months of 2021. So you can enter to win these tickets by taking a screenshot of your review and submitting that through the Contact Us option on our website, which is grimdrive.com. That's GRIMDRIVE.com. It will ask you for your name and email address, and will provide you the option to upload a screenshot file. So make sure you take the screenshot of your review before you actually click submit on your browser, because then it will go away. So you have to screenshot it, then click submit, and then go onto our website, grimdrive.com, enter your name and email, and attach that file, and you will be entered to win free Celtics tickets. One other reminder, all the helpful information and links that we described can be accessed in the show notes and on our website at grimdrive.com. That's it for today. Thank you for listening to the Grim Drive podcast for this discussion about Kevin Love and anxiety. We'll see you next week when we talk about DeMar DeRozan and depression.
Thanks, everyone.